Ryan Graves is a former US Navy lieutenant and fighter pilot. He was the first active duty pilot to come forward publicly about regular sightings of unidentified aerial phenomena. He's currently serving as the first chair of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics UAP Community of Interest, and is the co-founder of Americans for Safe Aerospace. He's focused on improving aviation safety and unraveling the mysteries surrounding UAP. Ryan recently created Merged Podcast, where he has conversations with pilots and other professionals about UAP. Timestamps are in the description, and we hope you enjoy the episode. So Ryan, to start us off, please tell me what has been the craziest non-UAP related moment and or incident in your entire career?
There's a few contenders, I suppose. One of the, I would say, hairiest experiences was on one of my first flights after I had arrived to VFA 11 after leaving the training squadron. I had finished near the top of my class in what's called the Fleet Replacement Squadron. Mm-hmm. And that qualified me for what's called Priority Alpha Placement, which means I could be sent to a forward deployed squadron or a squadron that deployed out in the kind of South China Sea, Japan type area where the seas are rough. So I qualified with that rating. I was immediately sent about 2 weeks later out to the USS Enterprise in the Middle East, where they were conducting operation support of, it was Operation Enduring Freedom. I was mixed up which one's which, but so anyways, I get out there, and before I can fly my first combat mission, which happened in about a couple of weeks, I had a number of kind of qualification flights to do with certain weapon systems and things of that nature now that we were in an actual combat environment. And so on one of the flights, I was flying off of my skipper's, my commanding officer's wing. So we took two F-18s out, launched off the boat, and we went to go fly to a targeting range in Saudi Arabia somewhere.
Yeah.
And so I'm just, I'm happy to be there. I'm just kind of hanging on to his wing, and I have a senior weapons system officer in the back seat. And as we're flying out to the area, and it's about maybe like an hour transit, and then we'll drop the bombs and it'll take like 30 seconds and then we'll transit back. So it's like mostly non-action on this type of flight. But as I'm flying out there, I'm flying and I'm just like, all of a sudden I'm noticing something a little wrong with my stick. And it's hard to kind of communicate. At first, I didn't even think there was anything wrong, but it was just hard to quantify. But it was just something just didn't feel right in the stick. Mm-hmm. Eventually, it got worse and worse. And I was like, okay, this is really something that's happened. It's not just a weird wind shear or I'm getting caught in my lead wing vortices or anything like that. Right. I talked to the weapons system officer in the back, and he's like, well, everything shows fine on our systems. There's no failures in our hydraulics. There's nothing in our flight control systems, and all this I had already checked. I have the ability to check that too. But it was like, it's like, I know nothing's like wrong, but I'm telling you something doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
And it's just something like, wrong. And we chirp into my flight lead and just kind of let him know at this point, like, hey, I'm getting some kind of feedback in my stick, basically at this point. I don't, it's not really affecting my ability to fly aircraft, but it is noticeable. And so, it's like, all right, roger that, monitor it, which is, what else are you going to do? And so we go and we roll in the bombs on this target range. And it involves actually like us diving in, pointing the nose like 45 degrees nose down and, darting towards the ground, releasing the bombs and pulling up. And we're doing this side by side with each other. We're coming in, we roll in right next to each other, and we come in, we drop the bombs at the same time. We come out. I bailed out halfway through that dive and essentially came out top, and he did his thing, and I met him up on the top, and he's like, what happened? And I said, it got a lot worse when I went in that roll. The feedback on the stick. Yeah. And they're like, okay. And now it just started progressively getting worse and worse. Oh, right. And we have an hour flight back to the boat. And I'm noticing that if I want to move the aircraft to the right, that it actually requires two hands for me to take the stick and push the stick over. to
Oh,
get
right. Yeah.
the aircraft to come to the right. And if I tap the stick to the left just slightly, the whole thing just kind of like flopped over like 100 degrees,
Oh,
120 degrees.
wow.
Um,
Yeah.
so I had this very narrow band right in the center where, that was acceptable for me to essentially control the aircraft now. And, I'm trying to communicate this, and this was a lesson that I learned, was that I should have just, I'm like communicating through the guy in the back seat who's then kind of communicating to the flight lead, who's kind of communicating to the boat, telling them I have a problem. I should have done that as a pilot, because, he would never translate that as well as I could have just communicated for it. But as like a super new guy, I just almost didn't feel comfortable. It's like, it's a common thing we kind of train to in tactical
Hmm.
aviation, to be able to, be able to move past that type of barrier and be able to communicate problems regardless of rank. But that was,
Yeah.
that was just, a slight failure of that in action, and a good learning lesson, but nothing overly critical. Long story
Yeah.
short, I'm questioning my capability to bring this back to the aircraft carrier. But no one else really seems to be like kind of getting the urgency in the situation, probably due to that communication failure that I just told you about.
Yeah.
The boat Rogers up my emergency. The landing signal officers acknowledge that I'm having some issues, but they just talked me back into the wire. Um, I had a non-optimal pass. Like I missed the 3-wire slightly and caught the 4-wire, so I got kind of like an average pass, but not like an exceptional pass, essentially. And I was kind of bummed out because I was like, man, like I'm barely, like, I'm fighting this aircraft. This thing's like hard to control, flopping all over the place. I'm wondering if I can even land on the carrier. And I had like a 90% accurate pass, and I'm kind of getting dinged because it wasn't like exceptional. So I'm kind of like, what the fuck? And then I realized that they didn't really realize how bad my situation was, because it just wasn't communicated. And then I got
Yeah.
in trouble again because they're like, well, why didn't you tell us it was a bad type situation? So a lot of lessons learned, but that was a pretty hairy situation, because at the time we didn't know how much worse that control issue was going to get.
Mm.
When I landed it, seemed in a steady state, but that could have perhaps got worse, where it limited my ability to control the jet whatsoever. Um, Anyways, we had to actually depot the aircraft, which means ship it off the boat, because what ended up happening was a bleed airline, which is superheated air from the atmosphere that goes through the engine.
Hmm.
One of the lines that carries that basically hot plasma is broke, essentially, and it was like a little laser inside the jet, cutting through the control feedback lines of the stick. And so it was basically, yeah, like a lightsaber just moving around in the jet, slicing things up. And it just so happened to do
Yeah.
that in such a manner that didn't trigger any, specific caution or warning, but was still severely impacting my ability to fly the aircraft.
Yeah.
That was
That's
probably my
wild.
most hairy situation, I'll say. Lots of good learning lessons.
Yeah. How much, like, were you freaking out when you were in that moment? Were you like
No,
pretty
there's no
scared, or were
freaking
you
out.
you keeping cool?
Yeah, it's just,
Yeah.
it's it's like carrying a bucket with a little bit of water in the bottom, and someone walks
Yeah.
up behind you and starts and puts a hose in the bucket. You know what I mean? You really don't want to spill any any of that water, right? So you might hurry, and but you can only hurry so much, right? And if you hurry too much, you're going to start spilling water too. So
Yeah.
really, you got to be smooth, and you got to be calm, and you got to just go through your procedures and deal with the situation and operate with what you have, versus just reacting in some manner. And that's the same issue we had with these UAP that we would see in our working areas, is that, we didn't like emotionally or freak out in any manner when we saw them. It was simply another safety concern that we would categorize as such, and then, you know, mitigate that by avoiding them,
Mm.
So people always ask very specific questions or try to get the details, but at the end of the day, we were trying not to, study these things in a sense. We were trying to avoid them and go about and do our
Yeah.
training. Um, I think that's changed to some degree now, but the same principles apply.
Yeah. So what year was that, by the way? Because that was when you were quite new to flying, so or to
That
being a
was in
pilot in the
2012.
Navy. In 2012, okay. So then there was only a couple of years before the UAP incident started taking place, since these UAP started buzzing around where you were doing your training. So let me ask you, before 2014, or before you ever first kind of had any involvement with a UAP while at work, what was your take on UAP or UFOs? What were your thoughts on the phenomenon?
I didn't even know it was, I had a general understanding of UAP from my UFOs from my childhood and that kind of
Hmm.
cultural concept, but I was not familiar with the terminology UAP. I didn't know the terminology phenomenon was applied to what people traditionally considered UFO.
Yeah.
So I didn't really think about it. I didn't have much background other than, again, that kind of early, you know, kid
Yeah,
years.
you were aware of it, like
Yeah.
yeah, no, but no particular interest or anything like
I
that.
mean, I was interested in the thought as a child, but it was just kind of like an
Yeah.
entertainment thing, just like I would say the majority of people. I
Yeah,
wasn't like
I would say,
opposed
I
to
would
it, like,
think
oh, I
so.
don't like that. I mean, I was super into science fiction and all that,
Yeah.
um, but that as like a topic of reality, it didn't enter my mind, frankly.
Yeah, and that was the same as a young adult. Like before we got to this point, you never really thought like, I wonder like what it
I
could be. You was
wonder,
just like,
but
oh, this is.
I didn't, draw any conclusions, certainly.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, you were. Yeah, that's interesting there. So then, tell me, was it 2014 that you first had any kind of vague encounter with UAP, or was it 2015? It was around that point, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was early 2014, and so I joined that squadron in 2012 after I finished that training. And
Yeah.
then I had all sorts of adventures, like I just told you, on the 4 months or so that I finished up that deployment with them. And then we
Hmm.
sailed back from that deployment, ended up in Virginia Beach, and we entered a maintenance phase. We started doing our normal flying, and we upgraded our jets in the late 2013, early 2014 timeframe. We upgraded the radar systems, and when we did that, that's when we first started detecting objects that we weren't seeing on the older radar systems and that we weren't expecting to see. And we didn't immediately assume it was something exceptional or anything like that. We assumed it was a radar error or software error related
Yeah.
to the update. And again, it wasn't like we all came into a huddle and discussed this. That was just kind of the general consensus if it happened to come up.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, Eventually, we got close enough. So when we lock something on a radar, or even if we don't lock it, if it's just kind of like one of the nearby objects, our sensors will kind of slew over to it. And so as we had these objects on a radar and our sensors are looking at it, that's fine. But as we get closer, all of a sudden, some of our other sensors, such as our FLIR, can pick up details of the object.
Hmm.
And although we thought these were simply radar errors, you still don't just not respect that radar contact when you're flying nearby it, right? You still pretty much lock everything up that comes nearby. That's what you do. So they have this thing locked up, not expecting much, but then there's an IR return, an infrared return from our FLIR system, which has a normal camera and a IR energy camera essentially.
Right.
And we were seeing IR energy come from the spot that was being um, that the camera was being dropped on from the radar, right? Not just in nearby, but in the precise location. And so this was correlating, and that's a term we use a lot as tactical aviators: correlation of targets. That correlates that particular radar track with another sensor that we can now visually ID energy coming from there, which increases our confidence that it's a physical object and necessitates us respecting them from a safety perspective at this point as well.
Yeah.
Um, Regardless of whether we see them or not, because we are seeing our energy come from some of them. Of course, at that point, everyone was, curious what they look like. Eventually, some people, flew by and tried to take a look, myself included,
Mm.
and it was strange. We wouldn't be able to see them really. And again, we're not sitting in this big council chamber discussing our experiences, but from just the banter and whatnot, most
Yeah.
people were not able to see them.
Yeah.
We'd see them on our radar. We'd consummate that merge. We'd make that merge happen by, and when I say merge, I mean like flying right up to it and taking a look, by having it on a radar and then, having it on our FLIR and then flying up close and then all our sensors showing us where it is. And then we're sweetening up and getting it so we're just below so we can look up and look for it. And all our sensors are telling us where it is. And we can see it on our helmet where all that gets pumped into. And then we
Hmm.
can't see it with our eyeballs. Um, and then we turn back around and there's the object again on our FLIR systems or on our radar.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the status quo for a little bit, until we started seeing objects, or excuse me, until someone in my squadron almost hit one of the objects that was located at the entrance to our working areas. So
Hmm.
if you imagine a 3D box off the coast of Virginia, everyone enters at a very specific point of that box at a certain altitude. One of these objects was right at that entrance point. And so the two
Yeah, that's
aircraft were
crazy.
flying, coming in at it, and the object went right between them. And the flight lead saw it, and he ID'd it as the cube inside of the sphere.
Mm.
Estimated the size, the diameter to be around 5 to 15 feet, just based off how it, went in between the aircraft. So they had some reference plane. And they knocked off the flight after that. Because they, like, hey, these objects are there now. We're almost hitting them at our working areas. We didn't see it on the radar. It's not safe to continue this flight if we're going to be operating these conditions. So they came back, canceled the flight, and that's when we filed our first safety report with the Naval Aviation Safety Center, where we said, hey, here we don't know what these are. It's just an object, but we are almost hitting them.
Yeah.
And again, we didn't think these were UFOs, whatever that means at this point either, or anomalous
Mhm.
in any sense. But there were some jokes to that degree, but we were really leaning more on this being some weird classified program that was making errors in how they were conducting their tests and operating places they
Yeah.
shouldn't.
I mean, whatever it is at that point, it's in your way, right? It's like it's in your path. It's in your playground. Yeah, it's a danger.
Yep. So so that was kind of the general consensus at that point. It wasn't really later until we kind of looked at everything from a more. And when I say we now, I'm kind of thinking more of more myself, really. Where we start to I start to look at things and the patterns and see that, hey, these things behaving in a lot of different ways that don't make sense, and not categorizing it in any way, but at least saying, well, it couldn't be that then, and it couldn't be that then. And that conversation has continued for quite some time, and we're still not sure what those objects are. We've had some comparisons with recent activities with NORAD and the shoot downs there. As that unfolded, it was very clear that there was an object operating with traditional technology and means that was identified as originating from mainland China. And we elected to shoot that object down. And then shortly after, 3 other objects were shot down as well. And it's been a very clear message that they're not the same thing as the other balloon.
Yeah,
they're objects, and that seems to be the end of the story. But that doesn't, we should be careful not to conflate that, mystery that's been handed to us by the government with what's been happening, off the East Coast.
Yeah.
Those objects could be balloons or they could not, but what that shows us is that we just don't know what's above our head as much as we thought we did. And one thing that I've always, heard is that people feel like we know every insect that moves above our airspace. Very clearly, we do not. And regardless of what those 3 objects end up being, it goes to show just how significant of a problem it can be if we do have unrecognized objects operating in our airspace, which is something I've been, that's what I've been claiming is a big issue for a number of years now. And I think those recent shootdowns put into perspective for a larger audience how critical some of the issues that we have to deal with as tactical aviators when we are dealing with unknowns or potentially adversarial platforms. And that's right. Like that's all it comes down to, right? It's just, there's objects that are potentially unidentified in our airspace. If it's adversarially, some type of adversarial intelligence collection platform, it's a national security issue. And if it's anything else, we need to be scientifically curious about it, because some of those things we're scientifically curious about may end up falling out to be a adversarial platform, right?
Yeah.
That like, just because we don't know what it is doesn't mean we absolutely have guaranteed it's not this. So we might actually pull out, something that our adversaries have in that anomalous bucket. But there's a lot more too. And, based off the trends of behavior that we've seen with these objects, I personally don't believe that our adversarial platforms account for 100% of what we're seeing. So we need to be able to be curious about that and bring resources to bear on solving that problem.
Yeah. It doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of the adversarial angle. It wouldn't make a lot of sense that the US is nowhere near where, a potential adversary is, because we think of the US as like a world leader in terms of technology, military, aviation, all of these kind of areas. And yet there is something or somebody or some agency with seemingly intelligently controlled craft that exceed all our understandings.
With the U.S. government and the Five Eyes, even more broadly, and really every military in the world, spends a lot of time worrying about technological surprise. We have been in a position where we are typically looking at not necessarily technological surprise, but innovative designs such as guerrilla warfare techniques that are hard to adapt with or hard to counter with technological solutions that exist. We see that in Afghanistan. We see that in Iraq. We see that in Vietnam. So we've traditionally not been in a position where we're concerned about surprise technology from adversaries right off our shores. But other countries are much more concerned about that. Ukraine, I'm sure, but even Australia, with China right to the north, they would be an ideal testing ground for some type of intelligence platform that was either balloon-based or something else, considering the strategic importance and location of Australia to China. So I think it's a global issue if we're gonna consider it not only as a national security threat, but from the wider Five Eyes, I think that we have a responsibility to our individual national securities to treat this issue with respect, or we're going to be technologically surprised, and the only thing we're going to have to owe that surprise to is our own malfeasance for being afraid of stigma.
Yeah, exactly. It seems like we as a species, as humanity, we've been negligent on this issue for too long, and it's time to start actually assessing it and actually doing things about it. Just briefly, let's go back to kind of 2014, 2015, and just tell me, because again, you were airborne when the Gimbal video was filmed, right, in that area. So were you getting the radio chatter from all of your, the other airmen, your colleagues, and
so that stuff you hear on the radio is what's called ICS, intercockpit system, and so we fly around F-18. It's kind of like a hot mic essentially, where if you say something in your mask without touching a button or anything, the guy in the back seat's going to hear it. So they didn't key the mic to talk to each other necessarily. They just kind of were reacting to each other naturally. And that was all internal to the jet. So there was no external comm about what the objects were that I'm aware of.
Okay, I got you. So from your point of view, when that was being filmed, what were you doing? You were aware that they were looking?
I wasn't
for this
aware.
thing?
No, I wasn't. I wasn't. I was doing my own thing. So the way it kind of works is you might have this again, block of airspace over here, and you got your boat operating over here, and everyone takes off at the same time. Everyone flies over here, and half the guys go over here, and half the guys go over here, and this is simplified, but then they do an air battle, and some people run out of gas first, and they come back first, and they hang out over here, and they hold at a maximum endurance fuel rate, which means they're basically done flying tactical, and they're just wait for their land time, and then more people trickle back, and people are holding, and then finally the boat opens up and you land. And so I'm over here doing my fight. These guys go home. They find something on the way home, investigate as long as they can, fly up to it. It's dark. They can't see it. And then they, hey, what the heck is this? Out in the east too, which is kind of getting further away from where we are. So they check it out, and then they go back to the holding pattern to come back and land on the boat. So that was the window essentially, and everyone else just kind of went down there. So they saw something because they happened to finish up first or whatever the timing was. I don't particularly recall. And so they were kind of just once you're out of that fight and your way and you're kind of transiting back, you don't necessarily have to be at a specific location if you have time. So if you want to go max endurance your way over to something interesting and look at it, then, theoretically you can do that.
That's pretty cool.
That's what the liberty they took to do, because at first they thought this was part of the training exercise, that it was some type of penetration test from a what we call red air platform, or a simulated combat aircraft that launches from the coast to test the aircraft carrier's capabilities, whether we intercept them in time. And it's just part of the training we were doing at that time. And so for them, it was like, oh, we're going to go intercept this thing because it might be part of the training, until they, were like, well, what the hell is this? Because it's, obviously wasn't what they were expecting to see. Because what they send over are just older tactical jets, years and relatively slow moving older aircraft with no radars and stuff, not weird drones that are, or whatever these are, doing crazy stuff. So not what we were expecting to see.
The guys see it, they're like, wow, training got wild this week. What are they throwing at us now? So as well, I was going to ask you with these the people that saw it with their naked eye, like, I mean, did you get to talk to them directly after that, or like how
Oh
did
yeah.
you how
As
did
soon
how
as they
did you
landed,
first? Yeah.
I was basically already back in the ready room, and they had gone directly to this kind of like intel debriefing space. And like when you land on the boat, like you get parked somewhere, right? So you might get parked 200 yards away from where you need to be, and then you
Hmm.
have to walk through a maze of stuff, or you might be like right above your ready room and you can walk in, right? I happen to be here and I walked in, I'm in the ready room, and they kind of came in through the back way and stopped in the intel space to talk about it. And some other people came up and I was in the ready room and they're like, hey, your buddy just got something interesting on the FLIR. You should go take a look. So I did. I went down to take a look in the intel space, and that's where the tapes were, the gimbal tape, and the situational awareness or SA page that you hear referenced in
Yeah.
by the pilot. So that's where we watched the gimbal video, watched the situational awareness page where we can see the fleet of objects as well.
Yeah.
All the intel folks were watching it. The admiral got called down. I kind of stayed in the back just to kind of watch his reaction.
Hmm.
And
Which was
he watched the video for like 6 seconds, didn't even watch the full thing. He just went and just turned around and walked out. Um,
really.
which to me, excuse me, which to me told me that he was aware of this issue.
Yeah.
Because we're all like huddled up watching this thing. He watched the whole video all the way through, which was surprising to me.
Yeah, very much so. Like if you're not aware of this, you're going to want to you need to see more data. You're going to watch more of the video to understand more, increase your knowledge. Yeah, to walk in and walk out, that's very, very bizarre. So in terms of the fleet as well, and in terms of the object themselves, a couple of things. Like were they visible? Because you were seeing them pretty much daily, right? You've gone on record about that. So
Not with
was
my
it
eyeballs, but they were on the
on
sensors and on
radar?
the FLIR and occasionally with the eyeballs. But again,
Yeah,
we were specifically not trying to overfly these things, right? Like we were trying,
yeah,
like, all right, it's in our area, let's not go to that one, go to the next one type situation. So yeah,
yeah.
they're always like within our vicinity, and we had
In
awareness of them.
when you were picking them up, was it normally at the same time on every day, or the same kind of
We
lighting, or
take off, they were
was
out
there
there.
any?
We land, they'd still be out there. We take off the next day, they'd still be out there. So it's
It was
just like
basically like they're always there.
they
There
were
wasn't
always
like
there.
they
There's never a
turn up at
time where we
10
go
and
out there and
leave
be like,
it.
oh, they're
Yeah,
it's off hours.
yeah. Or it's like it's raining, so they're not there. Like they're
Yeah.
just there.
And it's not like
Basically.
I can't claim that there's 100% that they were always there, but they were so
No.
ubiquitous that like it for us it was just like they're there, and if they're not, great. It's like it's almost like weather, you know what I mean? Where it's
Yeah.
like great, it's not
Yeah.
raining today, but it's not like we've like are measuring how many days it's sunny in a row
Mm.
kind of
But I guess after a
situation.
while, you're more expecting them to be there than not there. It's
Yeah, I
more
mean
like, oh, it's
we were expecting, we were briefing them
yeah,
in our brief,
yeah,
right? So
yeah.
now if we talk about the fact that this, we had put several reports out and this had continued to be a problem. We saw the gimbal out off the coast of Florida. Then we leave and we go to the Middle East and do a combat deployment. And these things are still off the East Coast. By the time we come back from that combat deployment, there's now notice to airmen that are published on a daily basis around NAS Oceania to say there's unknown objects operating in the working
Mhm.
areas and to be vigilant and avoid mid-airs essentially. And that's the best we could do at that point.
Yeah,
And we didn't know what they were. So the objects were again so ubiquitous, like you just said, that we literally did do that. We generally just said, okay, well, like we're gonna, instead of just briefing it every flight, we'll put it into the standard briefing for the whole base because it's so common.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so
Wow.
yeah, it became ubiquitous, and that's when I realized that it was still to that degree. I didn't realize it was still that ubiquitous until 2017 when the New York Times article came out, because I had
Mm.
left the squadron at that point, gone to Mississippi to be a flight instructor, still in the Navy, essentially, just kind of a different point in the pipeline. And yeah, I saw the New York Times article come out. I recognized the voice in the video. I was like, holy smokes, what's this doing here? you know, I didn't know there was a whole, background to that. I just thought that was that. That was the last time we really talked about it. It was that day. Other
Yeah,
than like the occasional story in the bar, but we weren't overly focused on the gimbal because, that wasn't the only thing as it is now.
yeah,
We were seeing videos all the time. So like, there wasn't a name for it, and that one wasn't overtly special to us in a way that we were always talking about it. But
yeah.
um,
That's what's really like a big difference with the kind of the Nimitz, right? Because the Nimitz is, it seems, at least from my point of view, it's like it was an isolated incident, whereas this with you, it's like a period of months or even over a year that this is just continuously going on for, which is just really, really weird, isn't it?
It is, and that provides data too, right? Because
Yeah.
there are some people, of course, at this stage in the game that are still like, well, is this, are we testing something up there? And it's like, dude, what are we testing? Between 2014 and 2023, like we're still testing the same objects, even with now that there's national and international attention on this issue
in the same areas.
Yeah, like I don't like relying on work done to prove a point, but at a certain point, you have to kind of look at the new situation and attention on it and see if that still makes sense with your original thesis.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me as well, with the, they were showing up as a fleet on the essay, on that, there's that famous, like we talked about earlier, the chatter on the radio. So how often was that happening in relation? And again, I know you can't give me an exact percentage or exact ratio, you haven't got the data in front of you, but roughly, how often was it that the fleet was visible when one of these craft was visible?
I never had seen them fly in formation until that point.
Okay.
So that was the first time we had seen an object that resembled the gimbal, and that looked like the gimbal. And the smaller objects resembled the objects that we were experiencing off the East Coast, so far as how they were presenting themselves on the radar. So loosely, with some confidence, I can say that they might have been the same object. I forget the original question, however.
It was just how often.
Oh yeah, but I'd never seen them actually fly in formation. There'd be groups of them, I would say, and they would be kind of maneuvering in proximity to each other, but not in what I would call a formation necessarily.
Okay. And there was no obvious interaction or anything between these craft. There was no obvious, things that you do in a formation normally that you could pick up on, or that anybody was really noticing.
One thing that was interesting was that the formation, the gimbal video, not in the video, but in that situation, they were going in like a wedge formation. And how normal aircraft essentially depends on how tight they are. So if it's a really tight formation aircraft, they can all stay in the same spot and just kind of turn, right? With some radius of turn and go in the other direction.
Yeah.
If they're spread out more and kind of or if it's a really wide formation, I'll just pretend like it's really wide with two hands here. These are all planes. There we go. Right. So if you turn like this, you can't just turn and stay together because the circle for this guy is so much bigger than the circle for this guy. So everyone's going to get strung out like this. You just can't do it. These objects, if they were really tight, you'd expect them to turn like this. Or if you expect them to behave like a jet, what would happen is as the turn happened, you'd expect all of these guys, if this is the flight lead, you'd expect everyone to kind of move to the inside of the turn and then reposition on the outside of the turn after, right? So instead of adding power energy to the jet with the throttle, you're going to burn gas. So you don't add throttle. You're up here, you reposition to the inside of that turn. And what that does is now allow you to gain position on the lead jet. And as he rolls out, now you can go back to your old position. You spent no energy, but you've gained position on him in a turn, right? And so if I saw five objects, I know it's maybe a little esoteric, but if I saw 5 objects in that turn, I'd expect them to collapse to the inside of that turn in a steady formation where they're still separated from each other by altitudes. And then I would expect them as they rolled out to kind of go back and reposition themselves. These objects operate a little bit differently. They started that turn, and instead of kind of going to the same spot, they almost scattered it a bit. And some went to the outside of the turn, some went to the inside of the turn, but they didn't uniformly go to the inside of a turn. They kind of just scattered about and looked all jumbly and then rolled out and then reformed into that wedge-shaped position again. So they did something in the turn, but it was much different than what we'd expect the normal mechanics for a turn like that to be.
Yeah, strange. I guess you didn't have any kind of explanation as to why. It was just bizarre, I suppose.
Part of the thought is that perhaps those objects turned in some unexpected way, similar to how the gimbal turned after further analysis in the vertical plane to make their very turn in the opposite direction. So some consideration to perhaps what was that formation, what did that scattering look like in 3 dimensions? I don't have that information. I just kind of, I'm making the analysis based off of a God's eye view. And from my memory, which, is only so reliable, but But yeah, that information I think would be, interesting to kind of suss out, to look at those mechanics and see how they compare to what would be optimal, to help figure out just how fuel efficient these are not, and how that relates to various technologies.
Yeah. So the two guys again that saw this cube in a sphere, they saw it with their own eyes. Are you in touch with these guys still? And do you have any idea as to whether they might come forward at some point?
Yeah, it's not like a secret who they are in the military, because their voices are pretty distinct, and
Yeah.
so they're not like, I don't think in a position where they're like, I don't want to talk about this whatsoever. It's just they're still in the military. They're looking down deployment cycles and stuff, and they're just doing their thing. I think when they get out, I would expect, or perhaps we'll see them talk about their stories more publicly, but it won't likely be until they get out. And
And do you have any?
a lot of people were planning on getting out, and then COVID hit, and a lot of people ended up staying in.
Yeah.
Because the airline stopped hiring, for pilots. So if, what do you do? I mean, that's really your only career, which is why it's so risky to talk about UAP.
Can't work from home as a pilot.
Yeah. So a lot of people, I'll say, stayed in the military or signed back up, which as pilots puts you around 14 to 15 years out of potentially 20 for retirement. So now you're like, maybe I'll do 20. And so a lot of those guys that people are like, when are they getting out, are at that point now, or approaching it, where they could make a decision to stay in or get out. So we'll have to see.
So you think there's a chance we hear from them in the next kind of few years? You think?
I mean, there's a chance, there's a possibility of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're going to keep working on them to whatever extent you possibly can, I suppose.
Gently, they have a lot of responsibilities and stuff. So I'm not putting that pressure on them in any sense, I'll say, or at least I hope I'm not. To have them speak about this, because one, there is a collection program now. And what goes into that is classified. And so, one, I'm not asking or expecting them to talk about their experiences necessarily in that manner. So it'd have to be done right as well, and all that takes time. So it's not impossible, but it's not like there's a moratorium on it necessarily. It's just kind of the nature of being, a busy fighter pilot.
Yeah, I got you. Okay, well, we'll hope for the best on that. And the last thing I want to ask you before we kind of move on to maybe the topic in general, a little bit more broadly, just about your experience again in 2014-15. I think it was on your website you mentioned that you saw about the Times article coming out in 2017, and obviously everything kind of came rushing back to you and everything. And I think you told me, I think you put on your website that you emailed Lou Elizondo and said, like, I seen that you've kind of released these videos with TTSA. I was airborne at the time of the Gimbal recording. Do you want to talk about the rest of the tape? Well, I'd like to talk about the rest of the tape. Can you tell me, like, briefly, like, what was on the bits that we haven't seen?
Sure.
I'm sure you've probably talked about it before, but I'm sure a lot of people that are listening and watching haven't heard that.
Certainly.
If there's any bits that you haven't mentioned before, then feel free to mention them as well.
We talked a lot about them just a moment ago, but I'll highlight those. But let me just correct one thing in your story. You were almost exactly correct, except for one thing. I didn't necessarily email Lou. I emailed the general To the Stars Academy email address number that I found on their website. So I didn't know Lou. I didn't have his email before. I just kind of Googled To the Stars, and that's what I found. So but otherwise, yes, that's exactly pretty much how it happened.
And he got back to you something like 9 months later, or
it was
like
that, it was a good like 3 or 4 months. It wasn't 9, but it was good. Like, it was to the point where I had completely forgotten about it. I had completely forgotten about it. I got an email. I'm like, whoa. Okay. And then I had a decision to make. And then I was sitting in the ready room, and I've told this story before, but this is why I asked this question. I was like, do I really want to like go down this road now, And I asked a bunch of people who were sitting in the ready room with me, who are all instructors from the East Coast, from the West Coast. It's kind of their second tour. So some people I'd been with on the East Coast, others not. But I was like, hey, do you guys remember those objects we were seeing off the eastern coast when we upgraded our radars? And, a quarter of the room like, oh yeah, I remember those. Like, why? Do we figure out what they are or something? And one person's like, oh yeah, the cube and the spheres, right? So I mean, I was like, okay, it was not just me. I'm not crazy here. Everyone, and there's multiple squadrons there, so it was a pretty broad survey, I'll say, from East Coast participants. But I was like, all right, it wasn't just me. We got to figure this thing out. We can't just ignore this.
Yeah. So from the rest of that tape, were there any other bits? I
Oh
know
yeah,
you said
yeah.
we
Let me
talked
answer
about it
your
already,
question.
and that's
Sorry.
like about the SA, the situational
Yeah,
awareness, the
so we talked
fleet,
about a
and all
lot of
that.
it, and a lot of it is the fact that there was a formation of them, and they were arranged
Yeah,
in a particular, wedge-shaped formation, and that they were proceeding in a direction, and they turned in the manner that I described to you a moment ago, in that scattered manner, and rolled out about 180 degrees. And then the gimbal object, from the perspective of a top-down view, proceeded in a direction. The wedge turns, and then the gimbal object ping pong balls and follows the wedge. That's from a top-down view. I've come to understand that it turned in the vertical. If we're now looking like horizontally, it didn't just kind of turn like this. It turned vertically, which made it look from the top down that it was
yeah.
instantaneous. But
Got
still
you.
a
You didn't
very
see any
interesting way to
direction.
turn, very tight, within a couple 100 feet.
Wow.
So very, very interesting. So, and then it continued to wobble and appeared unstable to a certain degree. And that's about all I have to offer on that. And so those are all details, obviously, you don't see on the gimbal video, but they are details that were on the situational awareness page, which is typically on the center console between our legs. And then we have the right DDI here, we call it, and the left DDI here. And this is where we put our FLIR. And this is where we put the situational awareness page. And we can put them on any screen, but that's where we have them as standard operating procedure. So when you record the right DDI, it also records the MCP, what is it? MPCD, MCPD, that middle screen. It records both of them, right? So if you have the FLIR, you have the situational awareness page with that radar information and everything else. And so that data would be interesting to analyze, to get, again, a better idea of the kinematics and how they're performing, and, what was happening earlier in the day too. Because just because the aircrew wasn't necessarily focused on that radar contact, it doesn't mean that that data wasn't gathered up by the jet earlier, right? And so perhaps there's more we could learn about the origins and things of that nature.
Yeah. And like you said earlier, there's loads of other little videos of like radar, well, kind of cut footage of radar and different things like that from those months and years when you were down there. So yeah,
when I was speaking,
we'd love to see it.
When I was speaking to the Senate Armed Services Committee on this, they were on one side of the table, and the Department of Defense representatives were on the other side of the table. And I remember talking to them, and they're like, you're saying you guys are seeing all this stuff all the time. Like, well, like, where is it? Why aren't you reporting it? I'm like, report it to who? Report it where? Like, here I am. Like, I am reporting it right now. He's like, well, where is it? I'm like, go in any squadron on the East Coast, go into their classified space with permission, of course, and ask some senior lieutenant for where the folders are that say cool shit I've seen, while flying, or some name subset of that, right? Because almost every squadron probably has one, and there's probably a collection of cool stuff you can go look at right now. And it turns out they went and did do that about 4 months later, because I started hearing from my buddies in the fleet being like, what the fuck is going on? Yeah, and that was probably how we started getting to the realization that we do need to start reporting these objects.
Yeah. Have you ever seen a UAP, or what you would describe as a UAP or UFO, with your naked eye? Like either during those months in the Navy, or since you've left, or whatever, since since then?
I don't believe so. I don't believe so. I haven't seen anything where I'm like, oh my God, that's something from somewhere else. I tried to, like I said, suss out what those objects were on the East Coast by flying up to them, but like many other pilots in my squadron that we'll hear from on my podcast and elsewhere, they couldn't see them either. It wasn't some kind of weird thing. It was strange to have them on all our sensors. And these are the sensors that we're using to join up on our lead moments earlier, that we literally trusting our life on. So no, I haven't. I don't have any personal experience in my my past. Yeah.
No, me neither. Two guys who have never seen a legitimate, unquestioned area, UAP, that we can say, wow, that's something that is not easy to explain. I've never seen something with my naked eye either. Obviously, I'm not a pilot, so there's that.
People also don't quite understand the scale of our operations as well. Like, when we're in a tactical aircraft like that, we own and operate within hundreds of square miles of airspace.
Yeah.
Right? And we control and manage the activity in those spaces. And so you can only see stuff, depending on how big it is, if it's 5 to 15 feet, within like 5 to 4 to 3 miles, maybe even 2 miles of your aircraft, depending on the weather conditions. So, like I said, you would have to be pretty lucky or unlucky to accidentally almost hit one of these objects if it wasn't on your radar. And we can solve problems and avoid issues many miles before they're a problem, right? So that limits the scope of our, the percentage of time or the ratio of times that we've tried to see these objects visually and the times that we've failed versus succeeded, right? Because again, sometimes we've succeeded in seeing them when we weren't expecting them to be there. Other times we know where they are and our radars are locked up and we're trying to see it and we can't see it. All in all, we just we just don't have enough information to say really what are the causes of this. Do they all 100% represent physical objects? Is there some other reason we can't see them? There's so many questions that we still need to answer with this.
Yeah, absolutely. The more we learn, the more questions we have. You said yourself just then that, you'd be pretty unlucky to have a near miss with one of these. But obviously, as you're fully aware, there have been near misses. I think the last time I heard, maybe there have been 11 that have been reported in kind of military aviation. But tell me, how much of a threat are UAP to aviation safety, and talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, people don't quite realize how we manage risk in the air. And as a tactical aviator, that is the epitome of that. We're managing the most risk and accepting the most risk and operating, to the highest degree possible. But the pressure is still there on commercial aviation as well, because, you have a lot of lives on board. They might be doing a different type of flying, but they mitigate risk to the maximal extent where we as tactical aviators accept a certain amount of risk in order to do our job. And so really that's all we do as aviators, if you really want to break it down, is accept and manage risk. And so we do that by building processes and procedures that are repeatable and trainable, that solve certain problems. And we do that typically, or I should say traditionally, by writing in blood, where something happens and someone dies and there's an investigation and we figure out what caused it and how we could have prevented it. And we implement procedures to prevent that from happening again. That's the entire aviation safety model. We are getting better with our tools and our data and our models and our predictive capabilities such that there are ability to identify problems before someone dies. I've seen it happen in the Navy when we had oxygen issues, and we resolved that without someone dying, thankfully, although many people die every year from oxygen problems in tactical aircraft. Not many people, but relatively, for our career, we have big problems with that jet, with those systems. And so we build these processes. And so at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if it's a quote unquote UFO or could represent life elsewhere, or if it's a weather balloon. If it's a cause for uncertainty, there needs to be a process for dealing with it, regardless of what it is. Because you're not there to make a conclusion about what it is. You're dealing with uncertainty, right? But for this particular type of uncertainty, we've not allowed ourselves to assess the risk. We've not allowed ourselves to categorize it as its own, potential to be mitigated. We've simply ignored it just because it's been different. And so, although, yes, we're not slamming, UFOs aren't slamming into, commercial airline traffic or anything like that. There are many cases, and I'm bringing them to light now, where pilots are experiencing things. It's pulling their attention away, and they do not have a method or procedure to deal with it or a way to report it such that there's an overall understanding of their colleagues on how to mitigate it, right? So it's just it's the one safety issue where we take all our safety best practices and throw them out the window and say we're not going to do it for that thing, right? And so again, it's not about one particular problem. It's about an uncertainty and the air crew's ability to deal and have procedures and feeling comfortable to report those uncertainties. And this isn't a new model for aviation safety. We've developed this over time in the 40s and 50s and 60s, where there were a lot of accidents. A lot of them were user error or mechanical, but they couldn't really figure out what the problem was because pilots were afraid to talk about it. They were afraid that they were going to get sued or they were going to lose their job because they were just trying to be honest about what caused the mishap. And so there was a misalignment, and they weren't incentivized to speak the truth, essentially. And so systems were created that pilots trusted that were outside of the legal jurisdiction for reparations, essentially, for reparations, I should say, of of families if there's accidents or anything like that. And what that did was remarkably increased aviation safety, because pilots started reporting all the issues that they were kind of either, subconsciously ignoring or felt uncomfortable reporting because they would get in trouble. And so we've minimized user error rates in aviation safety, almost to zero, although there is some underlying mechanical issues as well. Or actually, I'm sorry, take that back. We've taken mechanical issues almost to zero. And then human factors, and traditionally human factor interaction with now autonomous systems is one of the major factors for aviation accidents. So no, they're not slamming into UAP, but they're this one glaring hole that we have in our entire philosophy around aviation safety, and we're ignoring it because it's uncomfortable. And even with certain airlines, I won't use their name, they've communicated to all their pilots to say that they don't want them talking publicly about this topic or bringing it up. And these pilots, again, once they're in a career like this, it's all seniority based. So if you leave that company, you lose 30 years of your career potentially by going to a new company. You don't just laterally transfer to a senior position. So no one wants to, kick off their company or to risk their medical career to talk about this. And so
that's rough.
How are we going to prevent that, right? That's why I've created the Americans for Safe Aerospace, which is a nonprofit.
I was just going to ask you to tell us about that.
Yeah, it's a profit where we're going to be able to target legislative action to make pilots comfortable for reporting this. We're going to be looking to push a pilot protection program so that they're not in fear of losing their careers. And many other policy decisions I don't want to get into right now, but it's not about kingmaking or looking for candidates or anything like that. It's about pushing the UAP topic and understanding that, hey, if it's national security, we need to deal with it as a national security issue. And if it's anything else, we got to be curious about it. And we're going to encourage Capitol Hill to take this conversation seriously and to expand the coalition of senators and Congress people willing to look at this issue.
Yeah, which already seems to be growing, but no, it's so good that you're taking the initiative in that area, because like you say, it's aviation safety, it's national security, and apart from that is it's good old fashioned human curiosity. Like, we need to know what's going on. Tell me, apart from the 3 videos released by the Pentagon or kind of confirmed by the Pentagon, obviously one of which you were involved in that kind of whole situation, excluding those 3, what would you say is maybe, in your opinion, the most compelling case of UAP or an incident regarding UAP that is not easily explainable by prosaic explanation?
I think the 3 videos you're referring to are Gimbal, Go Fast, and Tic-Tac.
Yeah.
So it'd be outside of those 3. I'm going to go outside of this and go completely out of my comfort zone or area of expertise.
Please do.
And say that I'm always impressed by the stories of school children that have mass sightings in this area. And some of the various stories, I'm not going to list them out, but those are always
Aerial
very
school.
fascinating. Again, completely different track than seeing radars, and I get it. I'm going straight into the kind of UAP, UFO kind of realm by talking about that, but that's always been those are always fascinating to me on a personal level, to just see how the children react and how they engage in it. And, they just, they're not mastermind liars at those ages.
No. And the idea that they could, mastermind and come up with such a grand lie on like no notice, because unless we're going to give them the credit to think that they've planned this for weeks in advance, a bunch of kids. Okay, so on the in 3 weeks when they go into their meeting, we're going to all come on, we've all been a kid. I don't know what kind of mastermind child would go through something like that. But then you also have teachers, don't you, as well? Normally in these instances, there's normally at least a couple of adults that see things too and whatnot. But yeah, I'm with you. Those are pretty compelling. The 2 that stand out for me would be Ariel and Westall, but I'm sure there's loads that I haven't come across or I'm not aware of. Have you allowed yourself... In fact, before I ask you that question, let me read a quote from your article in Politico, your recent article. I think it was yesterday. By the time this is out, it'll be a couple of weeks ago. But you say, advanced objects demonstrating cutting-edge technology that we cannot explain are routinely flying over our military bases or entering restricted airspace. I just wanted to repeat it. It's just nicely written. It's a nice way of, it's summing up UAP. So on that basis, when we're looking at that quote, have you allowed yourself to speculate on potential origins or potentially what might be behind UAP? Have you gone down that, kind of potential rabbit hole, or have you looked at it from a scientific angle or from any kind of point of view? You must have reflected on it.
I would say I've reflected on it, but I have not looked at it from a scientific point of view. I've certainly, acknowledged the more popular thoughts on what they could be. There's the mainstream, not mainstream. I don't think we're quite there yet. But there's the general, there's the ET hypothesis. There's interdimensional type stuff, whatever that necessarily means. There's time travel, all
that
sorts
still
of stuff.
kind of is a bit much for me to get my head around.
I mean, I like to put my hand in the river a little bit and see what's down there. But we're not at a point. At least I'm not at a point with my efforts where we're looking towards conclusions right now. It's not about saying what is that anomalous thing in the bucket, but it's trying to make that bucket as small as possible. And we're still just trying to define the bucket right now, and we're cutting off some low hanging fruit to make it smaller now. But until we continue to make that smaller and continue to verify, not just think, but verify that it's not particular things, then we can't draw those conclusions yet. But I'm curious. I'm curious like anyone else, and I just kind of I play with the ideas of various possibilities, but it's not anywhere near a scientific endeavor at this point.
And let me say, I appreciate that you kind of, you're careful with your words on that. And obviously you think about it because you're human, but you're careful what you say and you want to keep this as, credible as possible because you want to push this into the mainstream. And I respect that and I appreciate that. Let me ask you maybe in a slightly different way. Let me say, because maybe it would be easier for you to, answer on this one. If I say, would you say, in your opinion, that it's likely that at least one UAP that has been, recorded via various means over the, say, last, 5 decades or what have you, would you say that it's likely that at least one UAP has an explanation, an origin that is not human, or at least not us in the sense of like, humanity now as we know it, as we see it?
I don't have that one case where I can pull out my pocket and give it to you or anyone else to say, here's why I think that. But the overall data shows to me that, what we're seeing can't be accounted for with terrestrial origins, in my opinion, just from my like personal explanation. Now, again, I don't have that one case to show you, but the vast amount of anecdotal data leads me to that conclusion. Yeah.
Have you got any thoughts, or have you kind of, I don't know whether you've looked into it much or whether you've been more focused specifically on the aviation safety side of things, but in regards to a potential connection with nuclear, nukes, nuclear weapons, nuclear, even power stations in some situations, have you kind of, have you looked into that at all? Have you got any take on that? Again, I know we're a little bit in speculation territory and maybe we're getting a little bit outside your comfort zone because we have to kind of, we don't have the hard data exactly to say exactly what's going on there, but have you
well, there's certainly been some reported correlations between activity of unidentified objects in the air around nuclear facilities. I mean, and again, we have data that is the case. We don't necessarily know why or what those objects are, or how they might be further subcategorized into, again, adversarial platforms or something else to be curious about. But that does seem to be a reoccurring pattern, not only associated with when this became more ingrained in our psyche as humans when we discussed this in the 40s and whatnot, but even I've been hearing cases of that being true around fixed nuclear facilities and having large amounts of reports in the vicinity of those as well. What it means, what can we gain from that? It's still too early, at least from my efforts.
Yeah, no, I agree. In terms of what it would mean, we're in speculation city, aren't we? We can go like, oh, do they, if it's something non-human, oh, do they want to protect us, or do they want to do the opposite? Do they, or is it something in the middle? There's so many potential, do they simply want to find out where we're at in terms of our advancement? There's so many that we could go down. Many. So but like you say, there does seem to be some kind of link, overlap, connection, whichever word we use, there's something there. We talked about it briefly earlier, the recent UFO shoot downs. Have you got, because again, it's just such a weird situation, the way it's all been handled, the way it's happened, the way it's been played out in the press, do you have a take that you're comfortable to share with me in terms of like what you think happened? Do you think they're genuinely confused, behind closed doors? Do you think they actually have identified these as maybe some other nation on Earth or something, and they just don't want to openly discuss it because they don't want to create any situation? Is it a different case? Is it that they're kind of muddying the waters and they're intentionally making a fuss about nothing just to kind of, muddy the waters of the whole UAP issue? Is there something else? Again, it's speculation, and there's so many different things I could come up with to think, oh, they could be doing that. It could be to do with this. It could, but it just
all
seems
those things are
weird
probably happening to some degree, but may or may not be intentional. I think, what I mean, just as a broad comment, not to be overly specific, but it is confusing. It is causing, I think, people to conflate concepts and ideas, rightly or wrongly, in various cases. So all that I think is happening, but whether it's part of a master plan or not, I don't necessarily know. Here's how I interpret it.
Yeah.
They were probably tracking the Chinese balloon. It got basically popped into the conscious sphere when it was detected. And so they reacted to say, okay, what else are we missing? And they publicly said this. They've lowered the speed gates on their sensor systems to account for slower speed objects. And they suddenly started detecting objects, and that resulted in 3 objects being shot down. So, that's what I've been talking about, how there are objects that are hanging out traditionally 0.0 or 0.1 Mach, although they would travel at higher speeds on occasion. Maybe that was to prevent detection, right? So they lower the gates, and lo and behold, the things that we said we were dealing with off the East Coast were popping up in other areas. But I don't necessarily think that means that they are the same objects that were off the East Coast. The flight characteristics that they at least communicated publicly indicated to me that they were likely objects that were drifting in the wind, that were more balloon-like objects, which, if we recall from the UAP task force and later aero reports, there was some percentage of balloon-like entities that weren't necessarily identified as balloons, but were in that category. Perhaps that's what these are. And, that could be classified as potentially a low-tech, highly observable type platform, such as that Chinese balloon, or perhaps it's something else. But I haven't heard any communication about any behavior that was similar to what we saw off the East Coast, such as airspeeds, such as being able to stay stationary against the wind. It's one thing to drift with the wind. That's fine, but that's not, people are going to see that. But if you're stationary against the wind, that can potentially be a problem for certain systems. Yeah, I'll stop there, I guess. But
no, that's all good. I mean, I guess you're the same as us, or the same as me, in that sense of like, it's confusing. No matter no matter which way we slice it, some things don't really all add up in how it's been handled.
But I'll say this: I'll say some of the confusion, I think, is because that whatever those 3 objects were that shot down, they could be prosaic, they could not be. The lesson is that we need to know what's up there, and we clearly don't. But what that did open up was an opportunity for the aero director to brief the senators and Congress people in a classified manner on the larger issue of the objects that had been brought to their attention. And I think we saw a lot of statements that were related to that briefing from the senators that come out and they're like, what the hell, like, this is a much bigger issue than we thought. This has been going on for a while. They're, X, Y, or Z. And so whether those 3 objects are related or not, it afforded the opportunity for that conversation to occur. And now I think much more people, again, are read into why this is potentially such a serious concern.
Yeah. So you think then that this whole incident that already seems to have been forgotten by like the media and everything, it's already like ancient history, even though it was only a few weeks ago. But you think that this whole bizarre episode that we've all just witnessed is going to be a good thing for transparency and disclosure on the subject of UAP? Do you think it's going to help? I think
it's good for national security. I think it's good for UAP. I mean, whenever we know what's above our airspace, and we're not taking for granted that we understand, what threats we might be facing. Again, we talked about technological surprise. Like, we need to be ready for that, regardless of where it's coming from. And so we need to have the, at least maybe imagination, but definitely courage to, look for objects that might not be there, regardless of the stigma.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think the next kind of year or two is going to hold in terms of, transparency and disclosure? And also kind of a side part of that question, do you know anybody personally that's planning to come forward under the new kind of Whistleblower Act and somebody that's unknown as of now to the public, or at least to the people?
I'm aware of people that already have undergone that process that are not known to the public. So the process does seem to be at least working initially, at least the reporting part of it. We'll see what the follow-up is.
Mm-hmm.
But to answer that question, yes. Looking forward to this year, in June, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, their Aviation 2023 conference, which is a conference for basically everything in the aeronautical profession, engineers, scientists, all that. The UAP Integration Outreach Committee will be holding a technical panel where 4 scientific papers will be presented on the theme. We'll also have 4 papers presented in an online session, so 8 total papers in June on this topic from the organization, with another set of topics and activities going on at the Ascend conference in October, which is the space equivalent of the aviation conference. So we're going to see some papers start coming out from the AIAA. We'll start to get some work moving on that front. I think we're going to see continued openness from the government in engaging with the populace on this topic. I think there's just too much interest for them not to, and there's too much attention on it. We're going to continue to ensure there is tension on it with the ASA as well, and to ensure that the legislators in Capitol Hill have the resources and backing they need in order to move on this topic, which is, had a lot of inertia and challenges just due to the nature of it, even with the missile shoots, I'll say, or the recent shoot down.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to see this move into a much more, mainstream conversation from the science and engineering perspective, but also national security as well, now that people understand that just brushing it off as a balloon is not a viable national security strategy.
No, it's not gonna hold water. So you've recently obviously started, everybody listening, watching is probably already aware of this. If I can introduce one person to it, then great. But you've recently started the new podcast, or the new show, Merged Podcast. So thank you for that. And just tell me briefly kind of how that came about and what your plans are with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it came about because people basically just kept asking, why are we only hearing from you? You keep saying this was happening so much and it's happening in commercial markets and X, Y, and Z. So, where are people? And I've been talking to pilots and they've been telling me that, they don't feel comfortable going on mainstream media. It's a big risk to them. I'm not a current pilot, so it's not a career risk for me to talk about this, but they're still flying and they're seeing these objects, but they just don't feel comfortable talking about it. There's no place for them to report it, just like there was no place for the military folks to report it. Their companies and the processes that they live inside the commercial airline industry prevent them from just, creating some internal process like that was done within the military. And so I created Merge as a serious platform where pilots could feel comfortable going into, a trusted environment with another aviator who knows how to ask questions about their experience, and show people that it is, more common than people think, by having those conversations and literally putting it out there for people to see and providing that platform. And it's been working. People have, more pilots have been reaching out. Not obviously, but the podcast has been well received, both from the community, I would say, but also from pilots that have been watching and saying, okay, I feel more comfortable talking about this now. And they've been reaching out. And so that process is working.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so promising to be able to coax more pilots that want to talk about it, but like you say, maybe feel like they can't, or they don't really have an avenue or an outlet to do so. So that is, so valuable. And I'm sure you've got plenty more pilots and everything, ready, waiting to release episodes with and to do recordings with down the line, including people from your squadron and things like that.
Yep, certainly. In fact, we've already recorded some of them.
Awesome.
It'll be airing shortly. But it will be more than just pilots too. We'll start to explore with some of the subject matter experts in this area. We'll start to explore, some of the side topics a little bit, as much as science allows. And we'll start to talk about various technology and how that can play into our advancement of our understanding of this topic, right? What sensor systems make sense, right? So let's bring it out of the shadows and just have a conversation about what things work and what things don't, and just like you would any other technology.
Yeah, awesome. And I'm glad you're here to hear you're going to be kind of exploring some side topics as well. That's really valuable. On that subject, what are your thoughts? Again, I know we haven't got long, and I know this is probably slightly outside of your, don't worry, I've got the time. And we're probably slightly outside of your comfort zone on this question, but maybe less so based on the fact you just mentioned you're going to look into some side topics. But UAP and consciousness, right? Link, overlap, again, like we said earlier with nukes. How do you kind of navigate that field for now? What is your take on that at the moment?
I generally don't navigate it at this point, just because it hasn't been a factor generally in how the topic is being approached. But I mean, we have to look at the lens with which we interact with the world, and that lens is our consciousness, our conscious experience. That is our first person experience. And a lot of anecdotal data related to this are first person experiences that are unique for the individuals. And so what that tells me is that there's perhaps a consciousness link, a first person experience link, if that's the case, whether that's a mechanical function or something deeper in our mind or our psyche that we're not aware of. That's all, I think, for me, a deeper part of the conversation. It seems a little bit mystical, but at the end of the day, that's just more likely just technology we don't understand if we're going to entertain the thought that it's coming from an advanced, technology culture, something of that nature, right? We kind of categorize advancements from the stuff we recognize, and we call that nuts and bolts, and the stuff we don't recognize as woo or whatever that means. But as we better understand technology, what we recognize is going to change, especially as we become more familiar with these topic areas. And so I think we'll probably recategorize those kind of limitations in the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I think people need to realize that a lot of nature, a lot of reality that we already accept as woo, there's some weird things out there that just exist. Yeah. And seeing as you mentioned that, like, are you aware of like the body of research and evidence for psi phenomena, or is this just something you're just going to begin to dip your toe into with Merged, or where are you at with that?
I don't have nearly as much knowledge on that as I've started to accumulate on the UAP topic, because again, I've only been doing it for so long. But I again just kind of aware that there are overlaps in the Venn diagram, it seems.
Yeah, most definitely. And I'll be more than happy to help you connect with some people that are in the world of psi research and things like that. So we'll talk about that after. The last thing I want to ask you before I ask for some kind of final words, a message, would be, obviously, other than an increased media profile and the obvious things like that, kind of change of career, change of lifestyle, how did the events that took place in like 2014, 2015 impact your life, your beliefs, your outlook, everything like that? How did it affect you, assuming it did?
That's a big question. I think that's still evolving in a sense. I don't think it's something I can look back and reflect on quite yet, because I feel like I'm still in the midst of that evolution. For me, it's, I decided to send a message in 2017, and to some degree, I've been engaged in this topic more and more ever since then, to the point where, a few months ago, I essentially left the normal career path, I would guess you could say, to do my own thing. So it's, I can't, everyone forms their own thoughts and opinions of the world based on their experiences and their interpretation of it. I happen to have experiences that were pretty exceptional, and like everyone else, they formed my they were used to form my understanding of reality. And the more I've understood that reality and come to explore it, the more I've committed myself to it, both from technology and conversations and political action with the ASA. So it certainly changed me in ways that I'll have to reflect on at some point, but it certainly changed the trajectory of my life, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, maybe next time we talk, I'll ask you again and see if anything's kind of,
people have asked me that. I feel like I've got that question once a month for the past 4 years or so, and every time it's a different answer. So
not original.
No, it's every time it's a different answer. I never know how to answer it, so it's fine. It's something I need to reflect on.
One day it's going to click, and you're going to be like, yeah, wow.
Like I said, we're not quite there yet. Yeah.
No, we'll get there, hopefully. Okay, well, look, the last thing I want to ask you for today, Ryan, before I let you go is, just if you have any last words, any words of wisdom, whatever it might be, for anybody that's watched and listened to this.
I guess I would say just, ask yourself, what are you going to do about this? I think one of the biggest crutches of the UFO kind of, I don't know how to categorize or define this, but the just general UFO culture for the past X years has been in a dependent relationship with the government, waiting or looking for information. And that's not necessarily wrong, but I think we're in a position where there are activities that the average citizen can get involved with to push this conversation forward in a way that hasn't been done before. So, what are we going to do about it? Let's not just wait for someone else to tell us how to feel about this. Let's talk to the right people. Let's deal with this issue and resolve it. I think that's a real possibility.
Yeah. Well, we need to all pull together and work towards that, because that's what we need, right? We need to resolve it. We need to understand what's going on one way or another, whether it's exciting or terrifying or whatever it's going to be. We need to know.
Absolutely. I agree.
I really appreciate your time today, Ryan. This has been a fascinating conversation. I wish we had longer, because I could talk to you for ages. Questions are popping into my head constantly. But yeah, I really appreciate you giving me your time and conversation, and I wish you all the very best with all of your efforts.
It's my pleasure, Ben. Thank you so much.
Thank you to Ryan Graves for talking with me, and thank you for listening. Please see the description for links to Ryan's podcast and social media, along with other relevant links. If you want to continue unraveling the universe with us, please subscribe, and if you want to help us keep making content, please consider contributing via Patreon. Thank you.